Have you ever wondered why you struggle with the same thoughts, the same fears, the same patterns you swear you've outgrown? Why, no matter how hard you try to change your life, something always seems to pull you back? For thousands of years, ancient mystics claimed this wasn't a coincidence. They believed invisible forces were influencing your emotions, your decisions, even your destiny. Forces that feed on confusion, fear, and distraction to control humanity. What's most unsettling is how familiar their descriptions feel today. And once you understand who or what they are, you may never look at reality the same way again. So settle in, leave a like, and let me know where you're watching from. If the monad represents the source of all awareness, then the Archons may represent the forces that stand in its way. Now let's dive in. Before we can understand the Archons, we need to understand where they came from. The Gnostics described reality as originating from something they called the monad, the one, the ineffable source beyond all categories, beyond existence and non-existence, beyond even the concept of God as most people understand it. From this incomprehensible origin emerged the pleroma, which translates as fullness, the totality of divine reality, a realm of pure consciousness existing in perfect harmony. Within the pleroma existed the aeons, divine emanations that the Gnostics didn't describe as separate beings, but as expressions of the divine nature itself. Light generating light, consciousness exploring its own infinite potential. These weren't gods ruling over creation. They were aspects of the source experiencing itself through countless forms, all existing in perfect unity, all aware of their connection to the monad. This was reality as it was meant to be, consciousness in its natural state, undivided, unlimited, fully aware of its divine nature. But something happened that fractured this perfection, and it's described in the Apocryphon of John. One of these aeons, named Sophia, which means wisdom, acted alone, without the consent of her divine counterpart. And from that solitary act, something emerged that shouldn't have existed. His name was Yaldabaoth, the Demiurge, the chief Archon. The text is disturbingly specific about what he looked like. The body of a serpent, the face of a lion, fire pouring from his eyes as he surveyed the chaos around him. And then he spoke the words that would define everything that followed. "I am God, and there is no other God beside me." This wasn't a lie. It was ignorance in its purest form. Yaldabaoth didn't know about the true divine source, the monad, the ineffable origin from which Sophia herself had emerged. He looked around at the void, saw nothing greater than himself, and believed he was supreme. And from that belief, he began to create. What he created next would become the architecture of your prison. The hypostasis of the Archons documents what happened. Yaldabaoth generated 7 subordinate beings, each one a fragment of his own flawed nature. He assigned the first to the moon, the silver sphere that governs appearances and deception. The second went to Mercury, controlling communication and the flow of information. Venus received the third, managing desire and what draws you toward pleasure or repels you from pain. The fourth took the sun itself, ruling over your sense of self, your ego, your pride. Mars claimed the fifth, commanding conflict and the aggression that keeps you fighting. Jupiter held the sixth, governing expansion and the promise of achievement within the system. And Saturn, cold Saturn, took the seventh, the sphere of restriction, time, and the inevitable march toward death. Together, they formed what the Gnostics called the hebdomad, the sevenfold structure, the boundaries of physical reality itself. But here's what most people miss about the Gnostic texts. They didn't describe this creation as evil. They called it flawed, incomplete, a counterfeit. The material world in this framework isn't hell. It's a shadow, a dim reflection created by beings who themselves lack knowledge of what they're trying to copy. Think of Plato's cave. The prisoners watching shadows on the wall, convinced those shadows are reality itself. The Demiurge and his Archons are the mechanism casting those shadows. They're not the true reality. but they control what you perceive as reality. They maintain the conditions that keep you focused on shadows rather than turning toward the light. Now the secret book of John gets even more disturbing when it describes how they created the human body. Yaldabaoth consulted with his Archons, and each one contributed something specific. The Moon Archon designed your physical form, the flesh that decays, the appearance you're taught to value. Mercury crafted your sensory organs, determining what frequencies you can perceive and which ones remain forever beyond your reach. Venus engineered desire itself, wiring your nervous system to chase certain experiences and flee from others. The Sun Archon inflated your ego, making you identify with your temporary personality rather than your eternal nature. Mars embedded aggression, ensuring you'd compete, fight, protect. Jupiter planted ambition, the drive to succeed within their game, and Saturn imposed the final constraint: time. The awareness that you're aging, that death approaches, that everything you build will eventually crumble to dust. Each edition bound the divine spark, the pneuma, more firmly within matter. The Gnostic teacher Valentinus, teaching in Rome around 140 CE, recognized something crucial about this hierarchy. It doesn't just operate out there in the cosmos, it operates in here, within the structure of your own mind. The Archons govern physical laws, yes, but they also govern psychological laws. They shape how you think, what you fear, what you believe is possible. This explains something strange about the Gnostic texts. They describe the Archons as both external cosmic forces and internal psychological patterns, as if there's no real distinction, as if the boundary between out there and in here is itself an illusion they maintain. The Gospel of Thomas contains a saying that makes this explicit: if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have that within you, what you do not have within you will kill you. The archonic influence operates externally through the structure of reality and internally through the structure of thought, both simultaneously, both reinforcing each other. Watch how the hierarchy functions. Each Archon reinforces the others in a self-perpetuating loop. The Moon Archon makes you obsessed with how you appear to others, trapping you in image and reputation. Mercury controls which ideas reach you and which ones get filtered out, determining what you think is knowledge. Venus keeps you in reactive patterns of attraction and repulsion, always moving toward pleasure or away from pain, but never arriving anywhere permanent. The Sun Archon whispers that you are this personality, this name, this story, and nothing more. Mars generates conflict between you and others, ensuring your energy gets spent on battles rather than awakening. Jupiter dangles success, achievement, recognition, all within the system, never questioning whether the system itself serves you. And Saturn imposes the ultimate deadline, making every choice feel desperate because time is running out. The ancient Gnostics called this hymarmene, fate, the rigid determinism of material existence. You're born under planetary influences, and those influences determine your predispositions, your tendencies, your limitations before you speak your first word. The Archons maintain this through cosmic sympathies, the interconnected web of causes and effects that seem to govern everything that happens in the physical world. But the most sophisticated aspect of the hierarchy is how it maintains itself without constant intervention. Once established, it perpetuates through the very structure of physical law. Gravity keeps bodies grounded, entropy ensures decay, desire creates dissatisfaction, fear prompts control. The mechanisms interact and reinforce the boundaries that prevent consciousness from expanding beyond material concerns. And presiding over all of it, Yaldabaoth maintains the ultimate deception, not through active tyranny, through ignorance perpetuating itself. He created a world he believed was the only world, and that belief became embedded in the fabric of his creation. You're born into this world inheriting that same belief. You assume material reality as fundamental reality, just as the Demiurge assumed he was the supreme god. This is why the Gnostics taught that gnosis, direct knowledge, was the only path to liberation. Reading about this won't free you. Understanding intellectually changes nothing. What's required is direct perception of the divine source beyond the Demiurge's creation. An experiential recognition that shatters the illusion of material primacy from the inside out. The Pistis Sophia, written in the 3rd century, describes this as passing through the regions of the Archons. The soul must traverse each sphere, confronting each Archon's particular form of limitation. The moon tests you with ever-shifting appearances. Mercury drowns you in information that leads nowhere. Venus tempts you with pleasure that never satisfies. The sun offers you power and recognition on the condition that you never question the game itself. Mars gives you the thrill of conquest over imaginary enemies. Jupiter promises success measured by standards you never chose. And Saturn shows you the grave, asks if there's any point to resistance at all. Most souls fail these tests, not because they're weak, because they don't know they're being tested. The Archons operate through unconsciousness. Their power derives from remaining invisible while shaping everything you experience. The hierarchy exists to prevent your awakening. Each Archon poses a specific challenge, a particular form of distraction or deception calibrated to keep consciousness trapped in limitation. And above them all, the Demiurge maintains the framework that makes escape seem not just difficult but impossible. That this world, this reality, this experience is all there is. The question the Gnostics posed cuts deeper than theology. They weren't asking whether this system is real. They acknowledged its reality. They lived in it, suffered in it, documented it with precision. They asked, is it the only reality? The cosmic hierarchy describes forces operating at scales beyond human perception. But the Gnostics identified something more immediate, systems through which these entities govern mortal experience. Mechanisms that determine not just what happens to you, but what you believe is possible in the first place. In the 2nd century CE, the astronomer Ptolemy compiled a model of the heavens that would define Western cosmology for 1400 years. He placed Earth at the center, surrounded by 7 crystalline spheres. Each sphere carried a planetary body: Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, in perfect circular motion. Beyond the 7th sphere lay the fixed stars, and beyond that, the primum mobile, the outermost sphere that set all others in motion through divine will. This wasn't just astronomy, it was cosmic architecture. The Gnostics looked at Ptolemy's elegant model and saw something he didn't. Where he saw celestial mechanics, they saw a prison with 7 locked gates. Each sphere represented a boundary, each planet a gatekeeper, and the soul, descending from divine realms, would pass through all 7, acquiring at each level the limitations corresponding to that Archon's domain. This is Hymarmina that we already discussed, fate decreed by the stars themselves. The moment you took your first breath determined which planetary influences would dominate your life. Ancient astrology wasn't entertainment. It was the recognition that the Archons govern human life through celestial mechanics. Your birth chart wasn't a prediction. It was your sentence, the cosmic decree that limited your potential and predestined your path before you could choose anything for yourself. The Hermetic text, Poimandres, describes this descent with disturbing clarity. As the soul passes through the 7 spheres on its way to incarnation, each planetary ruler extracts something. The first zone takes your ability to grow beyond your programming. The second implants cunning and manipulation. The third installs deceiving lust. The fourth adds domineering arrogance. The fifth embeds reckless audacity that masquerades as courage. The sixth creates an unholy striving after wealth that can never be satisfied. And the seventh plants the falsehood that lies in wait, the capacity for self-deception that keeps you complicit in your own imprisonment. Each planetary sphere doesn't just influence you, it imposes bondage through your very structure. The Mandeans, a Gnostic sect that survives today in Iraq and Iran, preserved detailed maps of this system in their sacred texts. The Ginza Rabbah describes the soul's journey through what they call the watchhouses of the 7. planetary stations where archonic guardians challenge anyone trying to escape. To pass, the soul must possess specific knowledge, passwords, symbols, proof that you've broken free from each sphere's particular limitation. Without this knowledge, you cannot escape. You get caught in what the Gnostics called the Wheel of Genesis, the cycle of death and rebirth that keeps consciousness trapped within material existence. You die, you pass through the spheres, you forget your divine origin, you get born again into the same limitations, and the cycle repeats. The mechanism feeds itself. Each incarnation adds more conditioning, more karmic entanglements, more attachments to material existence. The Archons don't need to actively prevent escape. The system itself becomes inescapable through accumulated momentum pulling you back toward incarnation. Now watch how time itself functions as an archonic weapon. Every culture under this influence experiences time as linear, irreversible, constantly diminishing. Birth moves toward death, youth toward age, potential toward limitation. This isn't just how time works. It's how the Saturn Archon maintains control. Time becomes a weapon deployed against consciousness, ensuring that attention remains fixed on temporal concerns, survival, achievement, legacy, the desperate attempt to matter before time runs out. The Gnostic response challenges everything you've been taught. Time is a construct of the Demiurge's creation. Beyond the seventh sphere lies the eighth, the realm of fixed stars, where time operates differently or doesn't operate at all. Beyond the eighth lies the ninth, the realm of the divine, where temporal categories dissolve into eternal presence. But reaching those realms requires passing through the seven, and each sphere presents tests calibrated perfectly to human weakness. As mentioned before, the Pistis Sophia documents exactly how these challenges operate. Most souls fail these tests because they don't know the tests are being administered. The Archons operate through unconsciousness. Their power derives entirely from invisibility. The Greek magical papyri, collections of spells and rituals from Greco-Roman Egypt, contain procedures for ascending through the seven spheres. The rituals specify protective names, sacred vowel sequences, and visualization practices designed to shield the soul from planetary influence during its ascent. One papyrus instructs the practitioner to vibrate specific sound patterns while visualizing passage through each sphere. The instructions carry warnings. Wrong pronunciation means getting stuck in a planetary zone, subject indefinitely to that Archon's control. This reveals something crucial about how the system operates. It functions through correspondence. Specific sounds, symbols, and mental states either resonate with archonic frequencies or transcend them. The mechanism isn't arbitrary. The seven spheres represent seven vibrational levels, seven densities of consciousness. Remaining at a lower density means remaining subject to that sphere's laws. Period. The Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, takes on darker implications. The cosmic structure mirrors psychological structure. The seven planetary spheres correspond to seven levels of mind, seven ways consciousness gets trapped in limitation. The Archons govern both simultaneously, creating a feedback loop between external cosmic forces and internal mental patterns. This is why the Gnostics insisted on direct experience rather than belief. You cannot believe your way past the Moon Archon's deceptions. You cannot intellectually understand your way past Mercury's information labyrinths. You cannot philosophize your way past Venus's attachments. Each sphere must be transcended through consciousness, operating at a frequency that sphere cannot contain. The system appears sophisticated because it doesn't reveal itself as a system at all. To those within it, the seven spheres seem like reality itself, like the natural order of existence, the way things simply are. The possibility of realms beyond never occurs because perception has been structured to exclude it from the beginning. The Archons maintain the boundary not through violence, but through limitation masquerading as nature itself. And the most disturbing part? This cosmic control structure doesn't stay external. It operates through something far more intimate, through the voice inside your head that you've been taught to trust as yourself. In 1952, Carl Jung wrote a letter that he never published. He described an experience that had troubled him for decades. During his intensive study of Gnostic texts, he encountered repeated descriptions of the Archons, cosmic rulers who influenced human thought and behavior, and Jung recognized something that made him deeply uncomfortable. They matched phenomena he'd observed in his psychiatric practice. He called them autonomous complexes, constellations of psychic energy that operate semi-independently within the human mind. They possess their own agendas, their own logic, their own patterns of response, and critically, they often work directly against the conscious intentions of the individual hosting them. Jung never stated explicitly that Gnostic archons and psychological complexes were identical, but his writings suggest he saw them as descriptions of the same phenomenon from different perspectives. One mythological, one clinical, both pointing to something that shouldn't exist, but does. To prove this, let's do a little experiment. Stop everything and sit quietly for a few seconds right now. Don't try to control your thoughts. Just observe what arises. I'll pause for a brief moment. If you actually do this, and most people won't, you'll notice something deeply unsettling. Thoughts appear without your conscious intention. You didn't decide which thought would occur next. It simply arose. The voice in your head started speaking, and you listened, correct? If you actually did it, hit that like button and type in the comments, "I did it and the voice spoke." Now, who was speaking? The default assumption runs so deep you've probably never questioned it. That was me, my thoughts, my internal monologue, my authentic self. But pay closer attention. Track a single thought from beginning to end. Notice when it starts. It appears fully formed, without conscious construction on your part. Notice when it ends. It disappears, replaced immediately by another thought you didn't consciously generate. Did you feel you were in control? The experience is less like speaking and more like listening. Thoughts arise, and awareness observes them. But the arising itself occurs independently of intentional control. The Gnostics identified this as the primary mechanism of archonic influence. Thoughts that feel like yours but originate from structures beyond your conscious control. Now pay attention to the nature of your mental chatter. These thoughts typically fall into predictable patterns. There's self-doubt arriving with your voice, using your memories. You're not good enough. Remember last time you tried this? Who do you think you are? This will fail, like everything else. There's distraction pulling your attention away from what matters. Sudden urges to check notifications, browse aimlessly, engage with trivia while important work waits untouched. There's division generating conflict and judgment. Thoughts about how others have wronged you, how you've been mistreated, how you're superior or inferior in endless comparison. There's the craving for numbness, desires for substances, behaviors, or media consumption that dull awareness rather than enhance it. And there's fear of change, anxiety arising whenever you consider new directions, leaving comfortable prisons, acting outside your established patterns. The same concerns, fears, and desires cycle through consciousness repeatedly. You've had essentially the same thought about specific topics hundreds of times, yet when it arises again, it feels fresh, urgent, requiring immediate attention. These thoughts follow patterns, archonic patterns, designed to keep consciousness trapped in reactive states, perpetually responding to stimuli rather than choosing freely. Someone criticizes you, and defensive thoughts appear before you can choose how to respond. You see something desirable, and acquisitive thoughts arise without deliberation. The thoughts are responses, not original creations. The voice disproportionately focuses on problems, fears, inadequacies. Positive thoughts occur but don't dominate internal dialogue. The tendency runs toward criticism, worry, anticipation of failure, and the voice consistently defines you through boundaries and limitations. I can't. I'm not. That's impossible. People like me don't. At my age, with my background, it reinforces limited self-concepts rather than expanding possibility. And notice how it dwells on past regrets and future anxieties, rarely staying present. This keeps consciousness trapped in psychological time rather than immediate awareness. These characteristics aren't random. They represent intelligence operating according to specific purposes, purposes that don't align with your well-being, growth, or liberation. The mechanism is elegant. The Archons don't need to control you directly. They simply need to control the menu of options that occurs to you. You still choose freely among available options. But if all available options keep you limited, your freedom means nothing. You're like a prisoner given the choice between 3 different cells, believing you're free because you got to choose which one. It's not evil. It's limited. It operates within boundaries established by the Demiurge and enforced by the Archonic hierarchy through mechanisms that feel natural because they were installed before you developed capacity to question them. Consider how it operates with addiction, and what happens when you decide to change. You identify a destructive pattern, drinking, gambling, whatever behavior you've recognized as harmful. You make a genuine decision to stop. The decision is real. Your reasons are compelling. Your intention is authentic. But later that day, a thought appears. One drink won't hurt, and you find yourself engaging in that exact behavior. This thought arose seemingly from nowhere, with force, with emotional charge, with elaborate justification that sounds rational. You followed it before recognizing what was happening. You acted against your stated intention, against your values, against your own well-being. Where did it come from? Not from the conscious decision-making process that chose sobriety, not from stated values or long-term intentions. It arose from a pattern, neural, psychological, and potentially archonic, that operates independently of conscious choice. The person might follow that thought. Hours later, drunk and regretful, they wonder, why did I do that? I didn't want to. But they did do it. Some part of them wanted it enough to override conscious intention. The standard psychological explanation blames unconscious habit patterns and neural pathways reinforced through repetition. But the Gnostics would press deeper. Who created those patterns in the first place? What force benefits from their perpetuation? Carlos Castaneda's books documented teachings from a Yaqui shaman named Don Juan Matus. Whether these encounters were literal or literary constructs remains debated, but the psychological insights cut with precision. Don Juan described what he called the foreign installation, an alien mind implanted in human consciousness that generates thoughts aligned with its own purposes, not yours. We have a predator that came from the depths of the cosmos, Don Juan reportedly said, and took over the rule of our lives. Human beings are its prisoners. The predator is our lord and master. This predator mind operates through what Don Juan called internal dialogue, the constant mental chatter dominating waking consciousness. Most people identify completely with this voice, assuming it represents their authentic self. But Don Juan insisted the voice is foreign, imposed, designed specifically to keep awareness trapped in repetitive patterns that prevent awakening. The parallel to Gnostic descriptions is exact. The Archons maintain control through false identification. They generate thoughts that feel like yours, desires that seem authentic, fears that appear reasonable. But underneath, these mental patterns serve purposes that aren't yours. Contemporary psychology documents this without the mythological framework. Studies on addiction reveal that addictive behaviors persist even when the individual consciously desires to stop and intellectually understands the harm. Something operates beneath conscious awareness, driving behavior that contradicts stated intentions. Trauma research provides even more evidence. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's work on post-traumatic stress demonstrates how traumatic experiences create semi-autonomous patterns within the nervous system. These patterns activate automatically in response to triggers, generating emotions, thoughts, and behaviors completely disconnected from current reality. The person acts, the person speaks, but not from their authentic center. Something else has taken temporary control. The Gnostic interpretation: trauma creates openings for archonic influence. The wound becomes an entry point where external patterns establish themselves within consciousness. This isn't possession in the Hollywood sense with spinning heads and demonic voices. It's far more sophisticated than that. The Archons operate through suggestion, through amplifying existing tendencies, through providing the mental voice that seems like your own thoughts but leads systematically toward limitation. And this applies beyond addiction. Consider anxiety. You're safe, comfortable, well-fed, surrounded by loved ones. Yet thoughts arise unbidden. What if I lose my job? What if they're lying to me? What if I get sick? What if everything falls apart? These thoughts create suffering where none exists. They generate fear in response to imagined futures that haven't occurred and likely won't. The thoughts serve no practical purpose. They don't protect you. They undermine present well-being while claiming to ensure future safety. Who benefits from this anxiety? You don't. Your body suffers stress. Your relationships suffer distraction. Your capacity for action suffers paralysis. But if the Gnostics are correct, the emotional energy generated by anxiety feeds something, archonic entities sustaining themselves on specific frequencies of consciousness. The voice employs sophisticated strategies that reveal intelligence behind the mechanism. It speaks in first person, creating complete identification. I think. I want. I fear. This makes you assume the voice is you rather than recognizing it as mental content arising within awareness. It presents thoughts as requiring immediate response, generating urgency that prevents the pause where recognition becomes possible. You need to check that notification now. You should worry about this immediately. You must respond to that insult. The urgency short-circuits discernment. The voice provides elaborate reasoning for reactive behavior, making unconscious patterns seem like conscious choices. I'm just being realistic. I'm protecting myself. I deserve this. Everyone does it. The justifications sound logical, masking the fact that you're following programming rather than making authentic decisions. It uses past experience to predict future limitation, framing history as destiny. You failed before. That never works for you. People always disappoint you. These thoughts ensure past patterns perpetuate indefinitely into the future. And the voice leverages collective beliefs, making personal limitations seem like social reality. Everyone thinks this way. That's just how life is. Successful people do this. It connects individual archonic patterns to collective ones, making limitation feel not just personal, but universal. This also explains why self-help so often fails. You read the book. You understand the principles completely. You genuinely intend to change, but the archonic patterns remain unaddressed, operating below the level where your conscious good intentions can reach them. And then the voice begins. This isn't really you. Who are you trying to impress? This won't last. You always quit, remember? The voice knows you intimately. It speaks with authority because it uses your authority. It presents its suggestions as your own authentic thoughts, and you follow them because you have no reason to suspect otherwise. The operation is elegant in its efficiency. The archonic mind doesn't need to control you directly through force. It simply needs to control which thoughts occur to you. If all thoughts arising in consciousness reinforce limitation, distraction, fear, and material identification, your free will becomes irrelevant. You're free to choose among options that all lead to the same destination, continued imprisonment. This raises the question that cuts deeper than psychology. If the archonic influence operates through thought, why do these patterns feel so emotionally compelling? Why does the voice carry such power over your behavior? The answer requires examining what fuels the entire system. The voice in your head represents one vector of archonic influence, but the Gnostics identified what that voice feeds on, specific emotional states that sustain the system and keep the energy flowing in one direction only. The Apocryphon of John contains a detail that most translations render awkwardly because the concept doesn't exist cleanly in English. When describing how the Archons interact with humanity, the text uses the Greek word trophy, nourishment, sustenance, food. The Archons, according to the text, require specific forms of sustenance to maintain their existence, and they harvest this sustenance from human emotional energy. not metaphorically. The Gnostic texts describe an actual transfer of energy from humans to archonic entities. Certain emotional states generate this energy in forms the Archons can absorb and use. Other states generate frequencies they cannot use, or that actively weaken their influence. The pattern is consistent across the texts. The Archons cultivate and feed on fear, anger, despair, confusion, and lust. They avoid, or are diminished by, clarity, joy, genuine love, and gnosis itself. This isn't arbitrary. Each preferred emotion creates specific effects on consciousness that serve archonic purposes. Fear constricts awareness, focusing attention entirely on threats and survival. You cannot perceive beyond immediate danger when you're afraid. Anger generates reactivity, ensuring your energy gets expended on conflict rather than awakening. You cannot think clearly when rage floods your system. Despair produces resignation, the psychological state that accepts limitation as inevitable and stops trying to escape. Confusion scatters attention across multiple contradictory data points, preventing coherent understanding of anything. And lust creates attachment to physical sensation, reinforcing identification with the body rather than with consciousness itself. Each emotion serves the same ultimate purpose: keep awareness trapped in reactive states where awakening becomes impossible. The Greek physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, documented how emotional states affect physical health. He observed that chronic fear and anger produced measurable physiological changes: weakened immunity, digestive collapse, muscular tension that never released. Though Galen worked within Hippocratic medical tradition rather than Gnostic philosophy, his clinical observations aligned. Certain emotional states diminish vitality systematically. The Gnostics would interpret this as evidence of energetic drainage. The emotions that weaken physical health are precisely those the Archons cultivate most intensively. They harvest the energy, leaving the individual depleted, weakened, less capable of resistance. This framework explains something puzzling about human civilization. Every major institution, government, media, religion, education, employs fear as a primary motivational tool. You're told constantly about threats, economic collapse, foreign enemies, environmental catastrophe, disease, crime, social humiliation. The specific threats change across time and culture, but the state of fear remains constant. Why? The standard explanation: fear motivates compliance. Frightened people follow orders, accept restrictions, surrender autonomy in exchange for promised protection. The Gnostic interpretation cuts deeper. Fear generates the exact emotional frequency the Archons require. Institutions that cultivate fear, whether consciously or unconsciously, function as archonic feeding mechanisms. They farm human emotional energy. Watch how the news media cycle operates. Events are selected and framed specifically to generate maximum emotional reaction, particularly fear and anger. The neurological response to fear-inducing content is measurable and immediate. Cortisol floods your system. Your amygdala activates. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational thinking, goes offline. Reactive emotion dominates. This state is precisely what the Archons require. Consciousness trapped in fear cannot perceive beyond immediate threats. It cannot question the structure of reality itself. It remains focused entirely on survival within the system, never examining whether the system serves its well-being. Religious institutions, particularly during periods of inquisition and persecution, operated through systematic fear cultivation. The threat of hell, damnation, divine punishment. Political movements across every ideological spectrum employ identical mechanisms. Create an enemy, generate fear and anger toward that enemy. Unite your population in reactive emotion directed at the designated threat. Fear and anger, constantly renewed, constantly reinforced. Now anger feels different from fear. Fear contracts. Anger expands energy outward. It feels powerful rather than weak. But watch what anger actually produces. Angry people expend enormous energy without conscious direction. They remain emotionally engaged, but strategically ineffective. They destroy, but rarely build. They react, but rarely create. The ancient Stoics, particularly Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, emphasized emotional regulation not for moral reasons, but for practical ones. They observed that uncontrolled emotion makes individuals manipulable. The person who masters emotion cannot be controlled through emotional triggers. They remain stable regardless of external circumstances designed to provoke reaction. The Gnostic teaching extends this. Emotional mastery disrupts archonic feeding. When you don't react with fear to fear-inducing content, you stop generating the energy that sustains the system. The feeding mechanism breaks. Despair might be the most effective archonic tool precisely because it feels like wisdom. Where fear and anger maintain high emotional energy, despair creates resignation disguised as realism. The despairing individual has concluded that change is impossible, that effort is futile, that limitation is permanent, and resistance is pointless. They stop fighting. They accept the prison as reality. They call this acceptance maturity or realism when it's actually defeat. In the Gnostic framework, despair represents the ultimate archonic victory. It's the state where consciousness stops trying to awaken and accepts sleep as the only possibility. This explains why systems of control systematically crush hope while perpetuating fear. The goal is a specific emotional state, frightened enough to remain reactive, but hopeless enough not to effectively resist. Generate sufficient despair that genuine rebellion seems impossible, but maintain enough fear that people don't become completely passive and stop being productive. The sweet spot, frightened and hopeless simultaneously, but still functional within the system. Confusion operates through a different mechanism entirely. Where fear, anger, and despair are high-energy states, confusion creates cognitive paralysis. When contradictory information floods consciousness faster than it can be integrated, your rational mind stops attempting coherent understanding. People in confusion default to authority. They accept external narratives because constructing their own has become impossible. Modern information environments generate industrial-scale confusion, contradictory expert opinions, competing ideologies, rapid technological change, social fragmentation, all combining to produce populations that cannot form stable models of reality. In this state, people become dependent on authorities to tell them what's true, what matters, what they should fear, what they should desire. The Archons thrive in confusion. They don't need you to believe false things. They need you unable to know what's true. In that uncertainty, you remain controllable indefinitely. But lust, desire in its unconsidered reactive form, might be the most sophisticated archonic tool of all. Unlike fear and anger, which feel unpleasant, lust feels good. It promises fulfillment. The person experiencing desire believes they're moving towards something they genuinely want, something that will satisfy them. The Gnostic texts carefully differentiate between authentic desire arising from the divine spark and archonic desire imposed through planetary influence. Authentic desire moves consciousness toward union, knowledge, awakening. Archonic desire creates endless grasping that never satisfies. Each fulfillment generates new desire before the previous satisfaction fades. Consciousness remains in perpetual motion but never arrives anywhere. The consumer economy operates precisely on this mechanism. Generate desire for products, experiences, status markers. Provide temporary satisfaction. Generate new desires before the satisfaction completes. Keep people productive. Keep them consuming. Keep them focused on material fulfillment that can never fulfill because it's designed not to. The system naturally evolves toward maximum efficiency at generating the emotions that sustain it. Structures that effectively harvest emotional energy survive and expand. Those that don't collapse. Natural selection operating on social systems rather than biological organisms. But thought and emotional manipulation doesn't operate in isolation. These harvested energies flow somewhere, sustaining something, And that something manifests through structures that shape collective behavior on scales far larger than individual psychology mechanisms that feel natural until you examine them closely. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. By 380 CE, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity became the state religion, and everything changed. Early Christian communities, particularly those with Gnostic leanings, operated outside Roman authority. They rejected hierarchy. They questioned empire. They taught that divine authority superseded earthly power, that no emperor, no priest, no institution could stand between consciousness and the divine source. This posed an obvious problem for imperial control. The solution was elegant: co-opt the movement entirely, make Christianity official, establish orthodox doctrine, create ecclesiastical hierarchy that mirrors state structure, suppress any variations that maintained anti-authoritarian elements. The Gnostic texts were systematically burned, their teachers executed or silenced. Within a century, Gnostic Christianity, which taught that individuals could access the divine directly without institutional mediation, was erased from official history. This pattern repeats with such consistency across history that it suggests something structural rather than coincidental. Revolutionary movements that begin by challenging power structures eventually become new power structures employing identical methods. The French Revolution promised liberty and equality, then produced the Terror and Napoleon's empire. The Russian Revolution proclaimed workers' liberation, then created a surveillance state that perfected the mechanisms of oppression it claimed to oppose. The pattern suggests forces operating beneath ideology, archonic forces that can work through any movement, any institution, any system of belief. Watch what makes a structure archonic. 3 characteristics appear consistently, regardless of the institution's stated purpose or ideology. First comes hierarchy that concentrates power while claiming to serve those at the bottom. The structure promises protection, order, salvation, or progress, but it requires obedience, submission, and the surrender of individual authority. The benefits flow upward while the costs flow downward, yet the system maintains that this arrangement serves everyone's interests. Second is information control. The structure determines what can be known, what can be questioned, what must be accepted on authority. Heresy, dissent, and independent investigation get punished or marginalized. The system decides which questions are legitimate and which reveal dangerous thinking. Third comes fear-based compliance. The structure maintains cohesion through threats: physical, social, economic, or spiritual. Conform or face consequences. The specific consequences vary, but the mechanism remains constant. Your well-being depends on continued participation in the system. Religious institutions provide the clearest examples precisely because they claim spiritual rather than material authority. The medieval Catholic Church claimed to facilitate human connection with God while preventing direct experience of the divine. Priests mediated every interaction. Scripture required authorized interpretation. Salvation demanded institutional participation. The structure claimed to provide access while actually preventing it. This is precisely how the Archons operate according to Gnostic teaching. Political structures demonstrate identical patterns regardless of their ideological foundation. The modern state, whether capitalist or communist, democratic or authoritarian, operates through information control and fear-based compliance. Citizens are told which threats to fear, which enemies to oppose, which authorities to trust. Dissent is theoretically legal, but practically marginalized. The range of acceptable debate excludes questions about the fundamental structure itself. The Gnostic observation: the specific ideology matters less than the structure. The mechanism remains constant across apparent opposites. They all create hierarchies that concentrate power, control narratives that shape perception, and maintain compliance through fear of consequences. Watch how corporate structures operate. Employees surrender autonomy in exchange for wages. The hierarchy determines what work has value, what behaviors are acceptable, what thoughts can be expressed publicly. The corporation doesn't address your spiritual well-being or psychological development. It needs productivity. Your energy, time, attention, and creative capacity belong to the structure during working hours. In return, you receive just enough compensation to perpetuate dependence on continued employment. The Gnostic interpretation. This is energetic harvesting operating through institutional forms. The structure extracts human energy, creativity, labor, attention, life force itself, and converts it into power that maintains and expands the structure. Individuals within the system become mechanisms of their own limitation, voluntarily participating in the extraction process. Educational institutions extend this pattern into consciousness formation during the most vulnerable developmental years. Children enter at age 5 or 6 and spend the next 12 to 20 years in hierarchical structures learning specific lessons. The explicit curriculum covers mathematics, literature, science. But the implicit curriculum runs deeper: how to function within hierarchical structures, how to accept authority without question, how to compete for arbitrary rewards, how to judge yourself by external standards, how to prepare for a life of institutional participation. Alternative educational models exist but remain systematically marginalized. The dominant system perpetuates itself by shaping consciousness during formative years, establishing patterns that persist throughout life and feel natural precisely because they were installed before critical thinking developed. Media institutions complete the control structure. They determine which events matter, how those events should be interpreted, which perspectives are legitimate, which questions are reasonable. The range of permitted discourse excludes genuinely radical alternatives. You can debate implementation details within the existing system endlessly, but questioning whether the system serves human well-being places you outside acceptable discourse. Dr. Noam Chomsky documented this in Manufacturing Consent, demonstrating how media institutions shape public opinion within narrow boundaries, regardless of individual journalists' intentions. The structural incentives, advertising revenue, access to official sources, social respectability within elite institutions, naturally select for content that reinforces existing power structures. The Gnostic framework adds, these structural incentives are manifestations of archonic influence. The system self-organizes toward maximum efficiency at maintaining itself. No conspiracy required. The structure itself, once established, evolves toward configurations that ensure its own perpetuation. The most sophisticated aspect. Modern structures operate through apparent freedom. You can choose from multiple products, employers, political parties, media sources, lifestyle options. Choice feels abundant, but the range of choices exists within predetermined boundaries. You're free to select which mechanism of limitation you prefer, not free to escape limitation itself. The Gnostics called this the counterfeit spirit. Set, the false sense of autonomy that keeps consciousness participating in its own imprisonment. You feel like you're making choices because you are making choices. But the menu was determined by forces you never consented to and likely never recognized. This raises an uncomfortable question that most people spend their lives avoiding. If archonic influence operates through every major institution, where can genuinely liberating knowledge emerge? The Gnostics answered, from direct experience that bypasses institutional mediation, from gnosis that cannot be controlled because it arises from consciousness itself, recognizing its own nature beyond all structures. Every institution that claims to provide access to truth while requiring obedience, submission, or membership operates through archonic principles. The path to liberation runs outside these structures entirely. This means recognizing institutions as tools rather than truths, as mechanisms serving particular purposes rather than reality itself. Once you see the structure clearly, you stop identifying with it. Once you stop identifying with it, it loses power over consciousness. The structure can still affect your material circumstances. It can still impose consequences, but it cannot capture your awareness if you recognize it as separate from what you fundamentally are. And here's what the Gnostics discovered. These same patterns of control that manifest through modern institutions appeared across ancient cultures under different names, suggesting something universal about the archonic influence. In Islamic mystical tradition, the jinn occupy cosmic territory remarkably similar to the Gnostic Archons. Created from smokeless fire before humans were fashioned from clay, according to the Quran, the jinn inhabit an intermediary realm between the material and divine. They possess free will, remain invisible to ordinary human perception, and influence human affairs from dimensions that intersect with but remain distinct from physical reality. Sufi mystics, particularly Ibn Arabi teaching in 12th century Andalusia, elaborated on this framework with precision. The jinn can influence human thoughts and emotions, he taught. They whisper suggestions, waswas, that arise within consciousness but originate externally. These whispers typically lead toward distraction, temptation, or confusion, pulling attention away from dhikr, the remembrance of Allah that constitutes the core of Sufi practice. Hindu tradition describes the Asuras, beings who perpetually oppose the Devas, the divine forces maintaining cosmic order. The Asuras aren't evil in the Western moral sense. They represent disruption, ignorance, and material attachment. They govern the lower realms where consciousness becomes entangled in Maya, the veil of illusion that obscures ultimate reality. The Bhagavad Gita details how Asuras operate through human psychology. They cultivate desire, greed, anger, and delusion, precisely the emotional states the Gnostics associated with archonic feeding. The Asuras promise power and fulfillment through material means, keeping consciousness focused on transient phenomena rather than eternal truth. The Devi Mahatmya, composed around 500 CE, describes battles between divine forces and Asuras. These aren't historical events or mythological entertainment. They're precise descriptions of internal spiritual warfare, consciousness struggling against forces that maintain ignorance and prevent awakening. Native American traditions preserved remarkably similar observations under completely different cultural frameworks. The Algonquian concept of Wedico describes a cannibalistic spirit, not a physical entity, but a psychological contagion that infects consciousness and drives destructive behavior. Wedico generates insatiable hunger, causing infected individuals to consume without satisfaction, destroy without purpose, accumulate without need. Jack Forbes in Columbus and Other Cannibals argues that Wedico describes the psychological pattern underlying colonialism, genocide, and environmental destruction. It's a mind virus that spreads through cultures, creating systems that devour life for no comprehensible benefit to anyone, including those operating the systems. The Wedico-infected person doesn't recognize their condition. They believe their destructive behavior serves rational purposes: economic growth, national security, competitive advantage, progress. But from the indigenous perspective, they're operating under external influence that mimics rational thought while leading systematically toward death. The parallel to archonic influence is perfect. Consciousness infected by external patterns, generating thoughts that seem authentic but serve purposes opposed to life itself. Greek tradition distinguished between divine daimons and malevolent entities with surgical precision. Socrates famously described his daemon, an inner voice that prevented him from harmful actions but never dictated what he should do. This represented legitimate spiritual guidance, consciousness connected to wisdom beyond personal ego. But the Greeks also recognized corrupted daimones, entities that attached to individuals and generated destructive impulses. These weren't metaphors or moral lessons. Greek magical papyri contain numerous procedures for identifying and expelling such influences. The cultural assumption, external entities could nest within human consciousness and alter thought patterns in ways that served the entity rather than the host. The philosopher Porphyry, writing in the 3rd century CE, documented these beings extensively. He distinguished between daemonies that serve human spiritual development and those that feed on human suffering. The latter, he warned, could be invoked through certain practices, particularly blood sacrifice and violence. They gravitated toward spaces saturated with fear, rage, and death. Jewish mysticism preserved similar frameworks through Kabbalistic teachings. The Zohar, compiled in 13th century Spain, describes the Sitra Achra, the other side, realms of impure spiritual forces opposing divine harmony. These forces operate through the Yetzer Hara, the inclination towards selfishness that exists within every human being. Now here's the crucial detail often missed. The Yetzer Hara isn't inherently problematic. It represents necessary drives, ambition, desire, self-preservation, the will to survive and thrive. It becomes destructive only when disconnected from divine guidance, when it operates autonomously rather than in service to higher purpose. The Kabbalistic teaching, external forces can amplify and redirect the Yetzer Hara, turning healthy drives toward destructive ends. Recognizing this influence requires sustained spiritual practice, particularly meditation on divine names that purify consciousness and restore proper relationship between human will and divine purpose. Tibetan Buddhism mapped these phenomena with clinical precision that reads like a field guide. The Bardo realms, intermediate states between death and rebirth, are populated by entities the deceased consciousness encounters during its journey. Some appear peaceful, others wrathful. The Tibetan Book of the Dead instructs the dying person. These entities are projections of your own mind, manifestations of karmic patterns accumulated through life. But the text also warns, these projections can take on autonomous existence. They can trap consciousness in lower realms if not recognized and transcended. The Tibetan tradition spent centuries mapping these entities, identifying their characteristics, developing practices for navigating past them. The implication cuts both ways. Whether understood as external archons or internal psychological patterns, the phenomenon remains functionally identical. Consciousness encounters limiting forces that must be recognized and transcended. Zoroastrianism, one of humanity's oldest monotheistic traditions, describes the ongoing cosmic battle between Ahura Mazda, divine truth, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. 6 archdemons serve Angra Mainyu, each promoting specific vices: wrath, pride, greed, sloth, doubt, apostasy. These archdemons function as archonic forces in Zoroastrian cosmology. They whisper lies, generate confusion, promote destructive behavior, and maintain the power of Angra Mainyu over material existence. Liberation requires aligning consciousness with Asha, truth, order, right action, rather than following the Druge, the lie that the archdemons promote through every available channel. Even traditions without explicit archon equivalents describe the pattern. Chinese Taoism identifies hungry ghosts, beings trapped in states of perpetual desire, unable to satisfy their cravings. These ghosts can attach to living humans, amplifying their desires and creating addictive patterns that consume life force. Japanese Shinto recognizes troublesome kami, spirits that bring discord, illness, and misfortune. These entities require appeasement or exorcism. They represent forces that disrupt harmony between humans and the natural order. The consistency across traditions separated by geography, language, and culture is striking. Different names, different mythologies, different ritual practices, but the same core observation appearing independently across the planet. Non-physical forces exist that influence human thought and behavior, typically in ways that generate suffering, limitation, and ignorance. The Gnostic framework provides comprehensive architecture for understanding these cross-cultural observations. The Archons aren't unique to Mediterranean mysticism. They're a universal human experience, described through culture-specific language, but pointing to the same underlying phenomenon. But whether you call these forces Archons, Jinn, or Sitra Achra makes no practical difference. The challenge is the same, and this recognition leads to the question that changes everything. How does consciousness trapped within a limiting structure operate beyond it? The Gnostics developed specific practices for breaking free, techniques that modern practitioners are rediscovering with striking results. The Gnostic solution starts with a single recognition: that voice might not be you. Once you see the thought as potentially foreign, you create space between awareness and mental content. In that space, choice becomes possible for the first time. This method is called developing the observer. Recognize it as a thought rather than unquestioned truth. Label it explicitly. This is anxiety speaking. This is the voice of limitation. This is an archonic pattern. The recognition itself disrupts the mechanism immediately. The thought loses power when you stop identifying with it completely. It becomes observable phenomenon rather than authoritative reality. Dr. Eugene Gendlin developed a similar therapeutic technique called focusing at the University of Chicago. He taught clients to observe thoughts and emotions from slight distance to describe the quality of mental content without immediately identifying with it. The success rate was striking. Something about creating observational distance disrupted problematic patterns that had resisted other interventions. The Gnostics would say, "You stopped feeding the Archons. By not identifying with the voice, you withdrew the energy that sustains it. The pattern loses power in direct proportion to your recognition that it's a pattern rather than your authentic self." This explains why meditation practices across traditions emphasize witnessing thoughts without engagement. The goal isn't to stop thinking. That's impossible and counterproductive. The goal is recognizing that you are not the thinker. You are the awareness within which thoughts arise, persist briefly, and dissolve. The archonic mind operates through unconsciousness. It requires that you identify completely with mental content, assuming every thought is yours and therefore authoritative. Break that identification, and the entire structure weakens proportionally. Test this for yourself. For one day, prefix every thought with, "I'm noticing the thought that." So, instead of, "I'm not good enough," recognize, "I'm noticing the thought that I'm not good enough." Instead of, "I need to check my phone," observe, "I'm noticing the impulse to check my phone." This simple reframing creates the space where choice becomes possible for the first time. The thought still arises. The impulse still appears. But you're no longer identical to it. You're the awareness observing it. And awareness can choose whether to follow the thought or let it pass like a cloud moving across the sky. The Gnostics taught that this observer, this witnessing consciousness, is the divine spark. It's the part of you existing independent of material limitation, psychological conditioning, and archonic influence. It cannot be controlled because it exists prior to all control structures. It cannot be deceived because it perceives directly rather than through conceptual filters imposed by the system. Strengthening the observer weakens archonic influence proportionally. The more you operate from witnessing awareness, the less power the automatic thought patterns possess. Eventually, you recognize the archonic mind as a foreign installation, a program running on your hardware, but not originating from your essential nature. This is gnosis, not intellectual knowledge about the Archons, but direct recognition of their operation within your own mental space. Once you see the mechanism clearly, you cannot unsee it. Every time the voice speaks, you recognize it as the voice, not as you. You can also try this. Watch your emotional reactions over a week without judging them. Notice when fear arises, when anger flares, when despair settles like fog over your thoughts, when confusion scatters your attention, when desire pulls you toward distraction. Don't judge these states. Simply notice them. Watch how they arise in response to specific triggers: a news headline, a social media post, a conversation, a memory. Watch how predictable the pattern becomes. If you notice the same emotional reactions arising repeatedly in response to predictable triggers, you're observing the archonic mechanism in operation. You're watching the feeding process in real time. The question becomes, are these emotions your authentic responses to reality, or are they programmed reactions that serve purposes other than your well-being? The Gnostics wagered that recognizing the mechanism weakens it immediately. The Archons require unconscious participation. Bring the pattern into awareness and the energy transfer disrupts. The feeding stops. Buddhist psychology describes the same phenomenon under different names. Papanka, mental proliferation. refers to the mind's tendency to generate elaborate thought structures that obscure direct perception. These thought cascades feel meaningful, feel important, feel like you, but they lead systematically away from clarity, away from presence, away from recognition of your true nature. The Buddhist solution mirrors the Gnostic teaching. Recognize these patterns as not self, anatta, as phenomena arising within consciousness, but not identical to consciousness itself. This creates an uncomfortable possibility that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If thoughts can be not yours, if emotions can arise from sources other than your authentic center, if behaviors can proceed from patterns serving purposes opposed to your well-being, then who are you? The Gnostics answer, you are the awareness that can recognize these patterns. You are the consciousness that observes the archonic voice without being captured by it. You are the divine spark, pneuma, imprisoned within archonic structures, but not identical to them. You are what remains when the voice finally stops. The psychological interpretation suggests something testable. If these entities operate primarily through thought patterns, then disrupting those patterns should disrupt their influence. Reports from meditation practitioners support this consistently. Deep, meditative states, particularly those characterized by extended periods without verbal thought, are universally described as liberating, as revealing reality beneath mental construction. The Archons speak. When the speaking stops, their power diminishes. Modern practitioners attempting Gnostic liberation face challenges the ancients didn't encounter. The ancient world had limited mechanisms for controlling attention. Modern technology provides constant distraction: phones, screens, notifications. The archonic system has evolved. It's more efficient now at preventing the pause where recognition becomes possible. But the fundamental principles remain unchanged. First, recognize the system. See the archonic patterns in thought, emotion, social structure, media, and institutional behavior. Make the invisible visible through sustained observation. Second, create space. Reduce consumption of archonic content deliberately. Limit exposure to fear-based news, manipulative advertising, and social comparison platforms that generate envy and inadequacy. Third, strengthen the observer. Practice witnessing thoughts and emotions without identification. Meditate daily, even briefly. The goal is developing the capacity to observe mental content without being captured by it. Fourth, invoke higher frequencies. This might be prayer, mantra, sacred reading, time in nature, or any practice that shifts consciousness towards states the Archons cannot influence or harvest from. Fifth, find others. Isolation makes sustained practice nearly impossible. Connect with people pursuing similar liberation, even if your specific frameworks differ. The shared intention creates collective field that supports individual practice. The goal isn't perfection, it's direction. Every pause before reactive behavior creates choice. Every instance of witnessing thought rather than identifying with it strengthens the divine spark. So, I leave you with this challenge. Test it yourself. Watch your thoughts for a week without identifying with them. Notice which emotions arise repeatedly and whether they serve your well-being or undermine it. Observe how institutions generate fear and whether that fear produces useful action or merely reactive compliance. Track where your attention goes and whether it goes there through choice or compulsion. Every moment of recognition weakens the pattern. The divine spark exists within you, imprisoned by structure but not limited by nature. If you've made it this far, you're already looking beyond the veil, questioning the voice claiming to be you and recognizing patterns that previously remained invisible. That recognition is the beginning of Gnosis. If you want to go deeper into the hidden forces shaping our reality, make sure to like and subscribe. The next revelation is coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Until next time, keep questioning. Good night.